5 women came to his mountain. 5 women left before the week was out. The 6th one arrived, looked at the cabin, looked at him, and said, "Well, we both have work to do." She never left. Montana Territory in the year 1872 was a land that sorted people the way a river sorts stones. The smooth ones traveled downstream easily, carried by the current toward towns and comforts, and the particular ease of living among others who looked and behaved approximately the same way. The rough ones stayed where they were, lodged in the mountain creeks, too large or too jagged or too stubbornly shaped to fit the current that carried everyone else. Callum Breck was a rough stone. He was 43 years old, built the way the mountains were built, without consultation, without regard for proportion or aesthetics, simply assembled from available materials and left to stand. He was tall enough that most doorways required negotiation and broad enough that most chairs requested advance warning. His hands were the size of small skillets, scarred across every knuckle from decades of work that involved sharp things and hard surfaces, and the fundamental disagreement between human skin and frontier survival. His face was the kind that caused women to cross the street and children to hide behind their mothers and dogs, to lower their ears and reconsider their approach. Not because he was cruel, because his face had been constructed by 43 years of mountain weather and physical incident into something that resembled a landscape more than a portrait. A scar divided his left eyebrow. His nose had been rearranged by a horse that disagreed with being saddled. His jaw was wide and permanent, and covered in a beard that had evolved beyond grooming into its own ecosystem. But his eyes were the betrayal. They were brown, warm, deep brown, the color of good soil after rain, and they were kind. Impossibly, unexpectedly, inconveniently kind, as if God had placed the gentlest eyes he had available into the roughest frame he could find, and waited to see what would happen. What happened was loneliness. Callum lived on a ridge above the Flathead Valley, in a cabin he had built over 16 years into something substantial. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire structure, a porch that faced the valley where the sunset performed every evening in colors that made his chest hurt, because beauty experienced alone is just another form of pain. He wanted a wife. He had always wanted a wife, not as an accessory or a convenience or a solution to the problem of meals and laundry. He wanted a companion, a person to sit beside on the porch while the sunset did its work, a person to talk to who would answer back in words rather than the nickering of horses who, while excellent listeners, offered limited conversational range. The mail-order correspondence service was his idea, not from desperation, from practicality. The women within riding distance of his cabin numbered approximately 0. The women within the territory who had seen his face and expressed interest in further interaction numbered exactly 0. Mathematics demanded he expand his search area. The first bride arrived in April. Her name was Helen. She was from Ohio. She lasted 4 days. She took one look at the cabin and said it was too remote. She took one look at the mountain and said it was too high. She took one look at Callum and said nothing at all, which said everything. She was on the southbound stage by Thursday. The second bride arrived in June, Margaret, from Pennsylvania. She lasted 3 days. She said the silence at night made her feel like the world had ended, and she was the only person left. She cried. Each evening and each morning, she asked when the next stage was leaving. The answer on the 3rd morning was today. The third bride arrived in August, Dorothy, from Virginia. She lasted 6 days, a record. She was tougher than the first two. She could cook and clean, and did not mind the mountain. What she minded was Callum, specifically the way he ate, the way he walked, the way he occupied a room so completely that there seemed to be no space remaining for another person to exist. She said she felt like she was living inside a bear. She left on a Saturday. The fourth bride arrived in September, Catherine, from New York. She lasted 2 days. She did not even unpack. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and cried and said she wanted to go home, and Callum drove her back to town in silence that was different from his usual silence. It was the silence of a man who was beginning to understand that the problem might not be the mountain or the cabin or the distance from town. The problem might be him. The fifth bride arrived in October. Sarah, from Massachusetts. She lasted 1 day. She stepped off the stage, looked at him, and said with a candor that he would have appreciated under different circumstances, "I cannot do this." She did not even visit the cabin. She reboarded the same stage she had arrived on and disappeared back into the world of smooth stones carried downstream. 5 women, 5 departures, 5 confirmations of something Callum had suspected since boyhood, but had never heard stated so clearly by so many people in such a short period of time. He was too much, too big, too rough, too remote, too far from everything the world considered normal. He was a stone too jagged for the current, and no amount of correspondence could smooth him enough to fit. He stopped writing letters. He put away the correspondence papers. He returned to his routine of solitude and horses and sunsets watched alone, and the particular ache of a man who has been repeatedly confirmed in his worst suspicion about himself. Winter came. The snow sealed the mountain. The world shrank to his cabin and his thoughts, neither of which was calm, horrible company. Then, in March of 1873, the trading post owner sent word up the mountain with a timber hauler. A letter had arrived. Callum had not written to anyone. He was not expecting correspondence. He considered ignoring it. He did not ignore it. The letter was from a woman named Ruth Fairchild. She was from Iowa. She was 37 years old. She had seen Callum's original advertisement, which had apparently been reprinted in an Iowa newspaper by someone who found it amusing. The advertisement had traveled further than any of his brides. Her letter was different from the others he had received. The previous respondents had written about themselves with the particular polish of women presenting their best qualities for evaluation. Ruth's letter contained no polish. It contained facts delivered with a bluntness that Callum found simultaneously alarming and refreshing. She wrote that she was not beautiful. She wrote that she was large, not tall, large. She used the word that other people used about her when they thought she could not hear. She had spent 37 years being the woman nobody noticed at dances. The woman whose mother quietly stopped mentioning marriage as a possibility. The woman who took up too much space in a world that preferred women who took up as little space as possible. She wrote that she was a good cook, not a pretty good cook. A genuinely excellent cook. She could make a meal from almost nothing, and a feast from almost anything. She could bake bread that would make a man forget his own name. She could preserve and pickle and smoke and cure and manage a kitchen the way a general manages a campaign. She wrote that she was strong. She could carry water and chop wood and walk distances that would exhaust women half her size. Because her size was not weakness. Her size was fuel. It was foundation. It was the physical architecture of a woman, built to endure rather than to decorate. She wrote that she did not expect romance. She did not expect compliments. She expected work and shelter and the basic dignity of being treated as a human being, rather than a disappointment. And she wrote one final line that made Callum read the letter 3 times. I understand you have difficulty keeping wives. I have difficulty being wanted. Perhaps our difficulties are compatible. Callum wrote back the same day. His response was the shortest letter he had ever composed. Come. She arrived on a Tuesday in April. The stage stopped at the trading post in the valley. Callum was waiting. He had not cleaned the cabin 3 times. He had not borrowed a coat. He had not polished his boots or trimmed his beard or done any of the things he had done for the previous 5 arrivals, because he had learned that preparation was futile when the outcome was predetermined. She stepped off the stage. Ruth Fairchild was exactly what her letter had described. She was large, not tall, wide and solid, and present in a way that occupied space without apology. Her face was round and reddened by the wind and framed by brown hair that she had pinned back with the practical efficiency of a woman who considered hair an obstacle rather than ornament. Her eyes were hazel, green with flecks of gold, and they were sharp, observant, the eyes of a person who had spent a lifetime watching the world from the outside and had developed exceptional vision as a result. She wore a plain brown dress that fit her body rather than attempting to disguise it. She carried one bag. She stood on the platform and looked at Callum the way a carpenter looks at a building site, evaluating, calculating. Not what was wrong with it, but what could be done with it. Callum looked at her. She looked at him. 2 people who had been measured by the world and found excessive stood face to face for the first time. You are bigger than I expected, she said. So are you, he replied. He said it without thinking. The words left his mouth before his brain could intercept them, and he immediately wished he could reach into the air and stuff them back behind his teeth. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the careful modulated laugh of a woman performing femininity. A real laugh. Full and deep and produced from a body that had enough room to generate sound that could echo off mountains. It was the loudest, most joyful, most completely unself-conscious laugh Callum had ever heard. Well, she said, still laughing, at least we will not have to worry about fitting through doorways together. He drove her up the mountain in his wagon. She did not speak for the first mile. She was looking at the landscape, at the pines, at the valley below, at the way the afternoon light made everything look like it had been painted by someone who was showing off. It is beautiful, she said. It is remote, he warned. The nearest town is 2 hours. The snow closes the road for months. You will hear nothing but wind and animals and me, and I do not talk much. I have been surrounded by people my entire life, Ruth said. People who look through me as if I were a window. Silence sounds like an improvement. They reached the cabin. She stood in the yard and looked at it the way the 5 previous women had looked at it, but where they had seen isolation and inadequacy and the end of civilization. Ruth saw something different. She saw a kitchen. The chimney draws well, she asked. It does. The root cellar is dry, mostly. You have a proper stove, cast iron. She nodded. Then she walked inside without waiting to be invited. Callum followed, ducking through the doorway the way he always did. He found her standing in the kit, Hen running her hand along the cast iron stove with the particular reverence a musician shows a fine instrument. "This will do," she said. "The cabin needs work. The kitchen needs organization. The pantry needs a system. And you need a proper meal. When did you last eat something that was not burned or raw?" "I do not remember." "Sit down." He sat in his own kitchen, at his own table, following instructions from a woman who had been in his house for approximately 4 minutes. She cooked. She used ingredients he did not know he possessed. She found herbs growing wild beside the cabin that he had been walking past for 16 years without recognizing them as food. She made a stew that filled the kitchen with a smell so extraordinary that Callum's horses pressed their noses against the barn window. She placed a bowl in front of him. He ate. He stopped chewing after the first bite. Not because it was bad, because it was the best thing he had ever tasted in his life, and his mouth needed a moment to process the experience before it could continue operating mechanically. "This is acceptable?" she asked. But her hazel eyes were sharp with amusement. She knew exactly what the stew was. She knew exactly what his face was doing. She had seen that face on every person she had ever cooked for, and it was the one area of her life where she had never once been found excessive. In the kitchen, Ruth Fairchild was not too much. She was exactly enough. "It is acceptable," Callum managed. She smiled, not the careful smile of a woman trying to impress. The satisfied smile of a person who has arrived at a place where their particular gifts are finally useful. She did not leave that week, or the next, or ever. The days found their shape around her presence the way water finds its shape around stone. She organized the kitchen with military precision. She cleaned the cabin not because it was dirty, but because she could see what it was supposed to be beneath the 16 years of bachelor neglect. She hung herbs from the ceiling. She reorganized the root cellar. She baked bread that made the cabin smell like a place someone actually wanted to be in. Callum watched this happen to his home, the way a man watches a sunrise he did not expect, with quiet disbelief, with the growing suspicion that something extraordinary was occurring. And if he moved too quickly, or spoke too loudly, it might stop. He tried to help. She redirected him the way a river redirects a log, firmly, without malice, with the absolute certainty of a woman who knew her domain and was not interested in sharing command of the kitchen with a man whose previous culinary achievement was producing bread that could be used as a doorstop. "You can help outside," she said. "Inside is mine." He did not argue, partly because she was right, partly because arguing with Ruth was like arguing with weather, theoretically possible, practically futile. She was strong, genuinely strong, not in the performative way that frontier mythology assigned to its heroines. In the practical way, she carried water from the creek without asking for help. She split kindling with an efficiency that suggested she had been splitting kindling since before he was born. She walked the mountain paths without complaint, and without the breathlessness that had defeated smaller women within hours. One evening, she found him on the porch, watching the sunset. She sat beside him. The chair creaked under her weight the way chairs always did. A sound she had stopped being embarrassed by approximately 20 years ago. "You are staring at the sunset like it owes you money?" she observed. "I like the sunset. You like it alone. That is different from liking it." He looked at her. She was not watching the sunset. She was watching him watch it. Her hazel eyes held something he could not identify. Not pity. Not romantic interest. Something closer to recognition. the particular warmth of a person who sees another person clearly for the first time and finds them not wanting but waiting. The other women left, he said, not with bitterness, with the flat, factual tone of a man reporting a harvest yield. I know. The trading post owner told me, 5 brides, 5 departures. He said, you were the territory's worst investment in matrimonial correspondence. That is accurate. Do you know why they left? Because I am too big, too rough, too remote, too much. Ruth was quiet for a moment. The sunset was doing its best work, purple and copper, and the deep aching gold that only existed in this valley at this hour, on this mountain. They left because they were looking for something you are not, she said. They were looking for a version of life that requires a different setting, a smaller house, a closer town, a man who fits inside the world they already understand. She paused. I was never looking for that. I was looking for a place where being too much was not a problem. Because I have been too much my entire life. Too large, too loud, too present, too visible in a world that prefers women who disappear. She looked at the mountains, at the enormous sky, at the valley that stretched below them like an open hand. There is enough room here, she said quietly, for both of us, for all of us, however much of us there is. Callum looked at this woman sitting on his porch, this large, plain-spoken, extraordinary woman who had arrived with one bag and reorganized his kitchen and baked bread that made his horses jealous, and who was now saying the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. There is enough room. 4 words, the opposite of everything the world had told both of them. You are not going to leave, he said, not a question, a realization. I am not going to leave, she confirmed. Your cabin needs too much work, and your diet is a humanitarian crisis. Leaving now would be irresponsible. He laughed. It surprised him. A real laugh from a place so deep inside his chest that dust probably came out with it. He could not remember the last time he had laughed. It felt like discovering a room in his own house that he had forgotten existed. They married in May, at the cabin, on the porch. The trading post owner served as witness and as the person who would tell the town that the mountain man had finally found a bride who stayed. The preacher read scripture. Ruth wore the same brown dress she arrived in, because it was her best dress, and because she saw no reason to pretend to be someone she was not on the day she was promising to be herself forever. Callum placed a ring on her finger that he had made from a piece of copper wire polished until it caught the light. It was not elegant. It fit. It fits, she said, looking at the ring. It does, he agreed. And they both understood. They were talking about more than copper wire. The seasons turned. The cabin expanded because Ruth had opinions about storage space and pantry organization that required additional square footage. Callum built what she designed. She designed what he built. The partnership was functional and efficient, and conducted with the particular chemistry of 2 people who had spent their entire lives being told they were too much and had finally found someone who considered them exactly the right amount. She taught him to cook. Not well, but edibly. He taught her to track elk and read weather and the particular way the wind changed direction before a storm that gave you exactly enough time to secure the barn if you moved immediately, and did not waste time being philosophical about it. They argued, regularly, loudly, with the full-bodied commitment of 2 large people who had strong opinions and the lung capacity to express them. The arguments were never cruel. They were vigorous. The kind of arguments that happen between people who respect each other enough to disagree completely, and then sit down to dinner together afterward, as if nothing had happened. Because the stew was too good to let a disagreement about fence placement ruin the meal. They had a daughter in the second year. A large, healthy, loud baby who arrived in the world with the same full-throated announcement that her mother brought to everything. They named her Hope because that is what she was. The physical proof that two people the world considered too much could create something the world considered beautiful. Years later, travelers through the Flathead Valley would sometimes hear about the mountain man and his wife, the couple who were both too big for the regular world and had found a mountain large enough to hold them. The story was told with warmth, sometimes with laughter, always with the particular affection reserved for stories that make people believe that there is someone for everyone, if you are willing to stop trying to fit and start looking for a place that has enough room. The 5 brides who left were never spoken of unkindly. They were simply wrong. Not wrong as people. Wrong for this mountain. Wrong for this man. They were smooth stones looking for a gentle current, and they found a mountain creek that required a different shape. Ruth was the right shape. Not the shape the world wanted her to be. The shape the mountain needed. Large and strong and capable and loud enough to be heard over the wind and warm enough to fill a cabin that had been cold for 16 years. She never once apologized for taking up space, and Callum never once wished she took up less. Because on that mountain there was room. Room for his. Size and her size and their arguments and their laughter and a daughter named Hope and a kitchen that smelled like the best thing anyone had ever eaten, and a porch where 2 people sat every evening watching a sunset that finally had the audience it deserved. Some love stories are about finding the perfect person. This one is about finding the person who fits, not perfectly, not smoothly, not in the way the world expects, the way 2 rough stones fit, side by side, in the same creek bed, too jagged for the current, too stubborn to move, and exactly right for each other. That is the love story of Callum and Ruth Breck, and the mountain held them both.